For Minister for National Development, I would like to ask the Minister whether he thinks that it is now time to consider codify environmental impact assessment and other similar assessment like the EBS into our legislative framework. That means to have a law that codify all these assessments. Quite akin to like what they have in UK, where it prescribes when the EIA must be done, and when it does not have to be done, it is usually because it's the legislation will state that it's because it's provided for in a differently scheduled provision under a separate area of law. And related to this, under such a proposed framework, I would like to ask the Minister for National Development whether or not he could, in the proposed review that he's looking into, to come up with a more, to consider a more holistic approach in assessment. At the moment, it's different types of assessment that we're doing, the EBS, the EIA, and the assessment that Mr. Chan has mentioned because of the different conditions. So I wonder whether we can have a more holistic approach. And I say this because, for example, in this case, both ministers mentioned about scrub land, this Kranji woodlands being a scrub land. And
Mr. Dennis Tan, if we can keep the supplementary questions short, because a number of members would like to ask supplementary questions. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, and there's some value in scrub land, and it will eventually develop. Currently, it provides for our biodiversity. There's wildlife, there's flora and fauna, but eventually it can also develop into something even better over time. So if we have a holistic approach that can look into land of such a nature, it's in between, it may not be secondary forest, but nonetheless it's important biodiversity that it brings. Next, I'd like to ask the Minister of Trade and Industry whether the Minister can confirm that Hwa Tiong has been paid for the land clearance work that it carried out in December and January, December last year and January this year.
If you look at the EIA framework as a whole, and legislation is a tool, as are other levers such as guidelines, incentives, processes, standards. They all are different tools with which we use to ensure that the framework is holistic, rigorous, and comprehensive. Now, as I said previously, no development, public or private, may take place without planning approval. And URA is a gatekeeper with the Planning Act and related planning legislation as that legislative gateway. As I said earlier, there is not only a master planning process in which multiple agencies representing the diversity of needs of Singaporeans, both present and future, but also representing the different constituencies and causes and concerns out there, come together regularly as part of the master planning process to look at our land use needs, including sites that we may need for connectivity, for biodiversity, for nature, for recreation. But also, when development plans are surfaced, way in advance of even the first works beginning on site, there is a screening process. All right, so URA acts as a gateway. The Planning Act and related planning legislation are the legislative tools which URA uses to provide that gatekeeping role. And a variety of technical agencies will then scrutinize the plans specifically. And each site will have its own variances, its own habitats, a whole own set of issues. Some of it could be traffic, some of it could be hydrology, some of it could be water quality, some of it could be issues of sedimentation, some about noise, some about biodiversity. And where nature and biodiversity are concerned, and parks, together with the professionals and scientists and arborists and horticulturists and conservationists and NParks, with the support of the nature community whom we consult regularly, we'll look at those sites. We'll look at those sites for which a development plan is put forward for approval, and then make an assessment and screen it, notwithstanding the upstream master planning phase when plans arrive. And then the different agencies, depending on the specific context of the site, impose or require the necessary consultations, studies, which are then pegged onto that planning approval legislative framework, right? This kind of approach allows for greater dexterity, greater responsiveness to the site in question. And so it's a professional assessment. It involves specific understanding of the site and the different considerations, both environmental and human. And then in June last year, in a private member's motion by member Louis Ng, together with agencies, the Wildlife Act was brought into force. And if members may recall, some time back, there was some question about whether there is legislative teeth for NParks to enforce in relation to biodiversity, environmental management, and monitoring. And so now, under Section 10 of the Act, there is significant legislative power for the Commissioner to impose the requisite studies, to impose the requisite measures, and penalties are as I've articulated earlier in my speech. And of course, there are other legislation involving, say, pollution of waterways, pollution of water bodies, rivers, streams, earth streams, so on and so forth. And so there is a legislative framework, and they all come together, not just codified and frozen in time, but responsive, allowing gatekeeping roles, allowing agencies to come in to make impositions, to impose studies, to then look at those studies and impose EMMP and other plans. Okay? So the approach is holistic. Having said that, in October last year, we sought to strengthen the capability of the sector, strengthen the capability that we have locally, strengthen both the understanding of developing agencies as well as EIA consultants. Our nature community tell us that actually what needs to be done is we need to bootstrap up the standards and ensure consistency in our biodiversity impact assessment capability, and hence a very comprehensive approach in our new BIA guidelines, which were launched in October last year. I'm not quite sure how you can codify something like a BIA guideline, which will be used across different agencies, because it is very comprehensive from a scientific basis, looking at different habitats. So whether it's a mangrove habitat, whether it's intertidal, whether it is secondary forest, whether it's scrubland, whether it is mature forest, whether you look at benthic habitats, all these are, specifically set out in very detailed guidelines put together by conservationists and in deep consultation with our nature community. And of course, when development is about to begin and is in progress, there are powers under the Parks and Trees Act, power to require a tree and flora survey, for which then you can decide whether to grant approval for the clearance of trees or the salvage or the conservation institute of trees on site of significance, as well as under the Wildlife Act, the imposition of EMMPs, as well as fauna surveys.
Can I also request that the ministers keep their responses as succinct as possible? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, sir, the answer to Mr. Dennis Tan's question is no. Hwa Tiong has not been paid for the works, the overclearance in January and December.